Hey everyone, and welcome. Tonight we're diving fork first into a world where your dinner could be worth more than your house, your horse, and possibly your least favorite cousin combined. You know how sometimes you look at the price of, say, a small bag of artisanal quinoa? Or one of those coffees that's been personally serenaded by a barista named Chad? And you think, really? For that, well, strap yourselves in, because we're about to take a little trip back to the Middle Ages, a time when your weekly grocery bill for spices alone could have bought you a small farm, a couple of sturdy horses, and maybe the farmer's cousin, Bartholomew, if he was having a particularly slow month. We often picture the Middle Ages as a time of knights clanking about in armor, magnificent castles, and perhaps a dragon or two if you've been reading the fun books. But it was also an era where food, believe it or not, was the ultimate bling. Forget your fancy carriages or gold chains. A well-stocked spice rack or a particular cut of meat on your table was the real power move. What people ate, or more importantly, what they couldn't eat, defined their entire existence. From the highest king to the lowliest peasant grubbing for turnips. And when we say expensive, we're not just talking about a few extra pennies. In medieval times, expensive often meant it involved incredible danger to acquire, traveled thousands of perilous miles, was controlled by powerful monopolies, or was so rare it might as well have been unicorn tears. The food on your table, if you were one of the lucky few, didn't just fill your stomach. It screamed your social status louder than any town crier with a particularly resonant bell. The modern idea of expensive food often boils down to clever marketing, or perhaps some niche farming technique. But back then, the cost of certain ingredients was fundamentally tied to life and death risks in their acquisition, and such extreme scarcity that possessing them was like holding a piece of almost supernatural power, not just a symbol of wealth. This wasn't just about having more money. It was about access to a different reality of consumption, a reality that actively shaped and reinforced the very fabric of society. The dinner table wasn't just for eating. It was a battlefield for social distinction, a daily, visceral reminder of who was on top and who was, well, eating pottage again. Now, before we dive headfirst into a world where a nobleman might casually snack on something worth more than your annual rent, a quick word. If you're finding this little journey into the bizarre and costly culinary past to your liking, and you'd fancy helping this humble channel reach its first milestone of 1,000 subscribers, a gentle tap on that subscribe button would be a treasure indeed. No pressure, of course, only if you're settling in for a good story and want to hear more tales from the dusty, and sometimes delicious, corners of history. It really does help us keep the metaphorical castle lights on. Right then, where were we? Ah, yes. The days when your dinner could bankrupt a small village, and a pinch of seasoning was more precious than gold. Let's start with the things that made medieval food truly eye-wateringly expensive. The spices. Imagine a world without your trusty chili flakes, your comforting cinnamon for that morning bun, or even basic black pepper. Sounds a bit bleak, doesn't it? For medieval Europeans, spices weren't just flavor enhancers. They were like edible magic, a fragrant whisper from distant, almost mythical lands. Their desirability stemmed from a potent cocktail of reasons. Of course, there was flavor. While the old cliché about spices being used solely to mask the taste of rotting meat is a bit of an oversimplification, medieval folks were actually pretty good at preserving food through salting, smoking, and drying. Spices certainly added a welcome complexity and vibrancy to dishes that might otherwise have been a bit, shall we say, robust. But more than flavor, spices were the ultimate status symbol. If you could afford to sprinkle your venison with a generous dusting of ginger, or color your custard with golden saffron, you weren't just eating, you were making a statement. You were basically a medieval rock star, and your spice chest was your jewel-encrusted guitar. Having a well-stocked spice chest was the medieval equivalent of having a garage full of hypercars. It announced to the world that you were wealthy, connected, and possessed a palate far too refined for mere salt and local herbs. And then there was the medicine. It wasn't just about showing off your wealth or making your slightly past its prime mutton taste less muttony. Oh no, these spices were also considered serious medicine. Back then, doctors and learned folk were all about something called humoral theory. The idea that your body was filled with 4 liquids or humors: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Your health, and even your personality, depended on these humors being in perfect balance. And guess what was believed to help keep them balanced? You guessed it, spices. Ginger, for instance, was seen as hot and dry. Perfect if you were feeling a bit too phlegmatic, which I think is medieval for a bit gloomy and damp. Saffron might be prescribed to cheer you up, while pepper could warm a cold stomach. So that eye-watering price tag suddenly seemed a bit more justifiable to the medieval mind if you believed these tiny, dried bits of plants were not only making your food taste like paradise, but also keeping you healthy, or at least fashionably balanced according to the latest medical thinking. This perceived medicinal necessity, intertwined with their rarity and cost, meant the elite were even more determined to get their hands on them, ensuring the prices stayed astronomically high. So let's talk about the crown jewels of the medieval kitchen. First up, saffron. Oh, saffron. This stuff wasn't just expensive. It was absurdly expensive. Derived from the delicate stigmas of the crocus flower, each one painstakingly harvested by hand, it took an enormous number of flowers to produce even a small amount. How expensive are we talking? Well, picture this. In medieval Europe, a single pound of saffron cost the same as a horse. Yes, a whole, living, breathing horse for a pound of tiny red threads. It was used as much for its glorious golden color as for its delicate, unique flavor, often appearing in elite dishes like vibrant egg tarts or rich sauces to give them a regal hue. It was edible sunshine, and it cost about as much as a small celestial body. Then there was pepper, the workhorse of the expensive spice world. Black pepper, along with its relatives like long pepper and cubeb pepper, was in incredibly high demand. It was once so valuable that it was counted out peppercorn by peppercorn and, in some places, even used as a form of currency or to pay rent or dowries. Forget Bitcoin. Medieval folks were trading in pepper. If you wanted to show someone you were serious, you might just pay them in peppercorns. And if you thought saffron was pricey, let's talk nutmeg in its lacy outer covering, mace. A pound of nutmeg, just 1 pound, could set you back the price of 7 fat oxen. 7! Imagine seasoning your Christmas pudding with something that cost more than an entire herd of prime cattle. Mace was equally, if not more, prized for its delicate flavor. These weren't just spices. They were investments, edible assets that spoke volumes about your financial clout. Cloves, ginger, cardamom, and the intriguingly named grains of paradise were also on the most wanted list, each carrying a price tag that would make a modern shopper weep. A pound of ginger, for example, was worth as much as a sheep. So that ginger snap wasn't just a snack. It was a statement of ovine sacrifice. These spices transformed mundane meals into exotic experiences, hinting at faraway lands and untold riches. And then there was sugar. We think of it today as a basic, almost unavoidable sweetener, something to stir into our coffee or bake into a cake. But in the Middle Ages, sugar, specifically cane sugar, was often categorized right alongside these exotic spices, and it was priced accordingly. It wasn't just for your tea, which, by the way, most medieval Europeans wouldn't have known anyway. Sugar was a luxury, a display, a high-status ingredient used in elite kitchens for both its sweetness and its ability to be sculpted into incredible edible artworks, which we'll get to later. Honey was the common sweetener for the masses, but refined sugar was in a league of its own, a true mark of affluence. So why all the fuss and fortune for these dried bits of plants? Well, their journey from the spice gardens of Asia, places like India, Sri Lanka, and the legendary spice islands of Indonesia, to the castles and manor houses of Europe, was an epic saga of danger, distance, and dastardly dealings. Many of these precious commodities traveled along the legendary Silk Road, which, despite its romantic name, wasn't a smoothly paved highway with convenient rest stops. It was a treacherous network of shifting caravan routes, snaking across thousands of miles of brutal deserts, towering mountains, and lands plagued by bandits. Imagine entrusting your fortune, a cargo of nutmeg worth more than a king's ransom, to a train of camels plodding through regions where a sudden sandstorm or a well-aimed arrow could mean ruin. Sea routes were no picnic either. Ships laden with spices sailed the Indian Ocean and the Red Sea, facing the constant threats of pirates, devastating storms, and the simple, terrifying reality of ancient navigation, where one wrong turn could lead to shipwreck on an uncharted coast. And it wasn't just goods that traveled these routes. These bustling arteries of commerce, both land and sea, also became unfortunate vectors for disease. The plague, the infamous Black Death that decimated Europe in the 14th century, is believed to have hitched a ride along these very trade routes, carried by fleas on rats stowed away on merchant ships or in caravans. So, your precious pouch of cinnamon might arrive with a horrifying, invisible stowaway. Bon appetit! The risks involved in every leg of the journey were immense, and each middleman, each stop along the way, added to the final cost. Once these spices miraculously survived the journey and reached the shores of the Mediterranean, the price gouging often kicked into high gear. Italian city-states, particularly the maritime republics of Venice and Genoa, became the undisputed masters of the spice trade with the East. They established powerful trading posts, negotiated exclusive deals with merchants in ports like Alexandria in Egypt, who themselves were often controlled by powerful entities like the Mamluks, and effectively created a near monopoly on the flow of spices into Europe. They controlled the ships, the warehouses, and the market. If you wanted cloves in England or saffron in France, chances are it had passed through Venetian or Genoese hands, and they slapped hefty tariffs and markups on everything. For instance, the Mamluks in Alexandria were known to place a staggering 33% tariff on spice exports, a cost the Venetians happily passed on, plus their own considerable profit margin. They were the gatekeepers of flavor, and they charged a very, very hefty toll. This chokehold on the spice trade was a primary reason why these ingredients remained so astronomically expensive for centuries in Western Europe. The enormous profits generated by this trade fueled the Renaissance in Italy, built palazzos, and funded armies. But it also sowed the seeds of its own demise. The frustration with these Italian monopolies and the dream of accessing the spice wealth directly was a powerful motivator for explorers like Vasco da Gama and Christopher Columbus. They weren't just seeking new lands. They were seeking new routes to the spices, new ways to bypass the Venetian and Genoese stranglehold and get a piece of that incredibly lucrative pie. Essentially, the quest for cheaper pepper and nutmeg helped to redraw the map of the world. Think about that next time you casually season your soup. The desire for these expensive foods literally changed the course of global history, concentrating immense wealth and power into the hands of a few merchant republics and eventually spurring the age of exploration. To give you a clearer picture, here's a little rundown of what some of these spices might cost. Not in coins, but in things a medieval person would understand. Imagine going to market, not with a purse, but with your livestock. You want a pound of that golden magic, saffron? That'll be one healthy horse, please. Thinking of baking some ginger snaps? A pound of ginger will cost you 1 sheep from your flock. If you're feeling particularly fancy and want 2 pounds of mace, the delicate lacy bit around the nutmeg, be prepared to trade a whole cow. And the nutmeg itself? A German price table from 1393 lists a pound of nutmeg as being worth 7 fat oxen. 7! For a pound of nutty goodness. It's no wonder that these spices were kept under lock and key, more valuable than the family silver. Now, if spices were the glittering, almost mythical diamonds of the medieval kitchen, then certain types of meat, particularly wild game, were the solid gold standard. You couldn't just pop down to your local butcher shop for a haunch of venison or a wild boar chop. Oh no. Acquiring and consuming these meats was a declaration of power, privilege, and often a whole lot of legal muscle. At the very top of the meaty pyramid was game. Venison, especially from deer like the noble hart, that's a red deer stag over 5 years old, and the feisty wild boar, was incredibly coveted by the aristocracy. Eating venison wasn't just about enjoying its rich, lean flavor. It was a clear statement that you owned vast tracts of land, or at least were very good friends with someone who did. This wasn't meat you bought in a marketplace. It was hunted, typically on the sprawling estates of the nobility. It was a symbol of their exclusive access to the land and its resources, a direct link to the aristocratic pastime of the hunt. Now, you might be thinking, well, if I'm a starving peasant and there's a plump deer wandering through the woods, surely a little bit of opportunistic hunting is fine. Wrong. Deadly wrong. This is where we encounter the rather terrifying reality of the forest laws. In medieval England and much of Europe, vast areas of woodland were designated as royal forests. These weren't necessarily forests in the dense, tree-filled way we imagine them today. The term forest in this context referred to an area set aside by law for the king's hunting pleasure, encompassing woods, heathland, and even villages. And these areas were governed by a separate and incredibly strict legal system known as forest law. These laws weren't mere suggestions. They were serious business, designed to protect the venison, the beasts of the chase, primarily deer and boar, and the vert, the green undergrowth and habitat that sustained them, for the exclusive enjoyment of the king and those he granted permission to. And the punishments for poaching? They were absolutely brutal. If you were caught merely interfering with the king's deer, perhaps by disturbing them, or even just being in the wrong place at the wrong time, you could face blinding or having your hands chopped off. If you were caught actually killing a deer, the penalty could very well be death by hanging. They weren't kidding around. Your desperate desire for a venison pasty to feed your hungry family could literally cost you an arm and a leg, or your head. Even seemingly innocent activities like collecting firewood, clearing land for crops, or allowing your pigs to forage for acorns within the bounds of a royal forest were heavily restricted and often required special licenses or payments, all to ensure the deer had plenty to eat and undisturbed places to roam. These laws created an almost unbridgeable chasm. The nobility feasted lavishly on the deer their peasants couldn't even dream of touching, let alone hunt. It was the ultimate haves and have-nots situation, enforced with extreme prejudice. The forest laws weren't just about preserving hunting grounds. They were a powerful instrument of social control and economic oppression. By denying common people access to a significant source of high-quality protein and other woodland resources, these laws physically and symbolically reinforced class distinctions and ensured the peasantry remained dependent on their lords, whose power was, in part, demonstrated by their exclusive right to hunt and consume these prized animals. If deer was the main course of status, then certain birds were the spectacular, often slightly ridiculous, and incredibly expensive centerpieces of the medieval feast. We're not talking about your average Sunday roast chicken here. For the truly elite table, birds like swans and peacocks were the height of fashion, though, interestingly, it was often less about their deliciousness and more about the sheer drama of their presentation. This is where medieval chefs, or cooks as they were more commonly known, went full theater kid. The preparation of a swan or peacock for a grand banquet was an art form in itself. The bird would be killed, and then its skin, complete with all its magnificent feathers, would be painstakingly removed, almost like a feathered jumpsuit. The carcass would then be roasted, often stuffed with other meats or forcemeats, and once cooked, it would be carefully redressed in its original skin and feathers, arranged on a platter to look as if it were still alive, perhaps even preening. Imagine a fully feathered, cooked peacock, tail fanned in all its iridescent glory, arriving at your table. Instagram would have absolutely broken. Sometimes the spectacle went even further. There are accounts of these redressed birds being made to, quote, breathe fire. This rather alarming culinary magic trick was achieved by placing a piece of camphor, or cotton wool, soaked in aquavita, or strong wine, in the bird's beak, and lighting it just before serving. So your dinner wasn't just dinner. It was dinner and a pyrotechnic show, with a faint hint of potential arson. The peacock in particular held a special symbolic place. It was a non-native, exotic bird, and its flesh wasn't even highly rated for taste by some contemporary sources. It was all about the magnificent display. There was even a ceremony known as the Vows of the Peacock, where knights and ladies would make solemn oaths over a lavishly prepared peacock, highlighting its importance beyond mere sustenance. Other birds also graced the noble table. Pheasant was a common sight for the wealthy, considered finer than chicken. Capons, that's castrated roosters, which made them grow larger and more tender, were also preferred over standard chickens. Partridge, quail, cranes, and storks might also appear, depending on the season and the host's ambition. Basically, if it had impressive feathers, made a grand entrance, and wasn't something a peasant could easily catch, someone rich wanted to eat it, or at least show it off to their equally rich friends. The sheer effort and artistry involved in these presentations, especially for birds not even prized for their flavor, tell us something profound. For the medieval elite, the symbolism and spectacle of food could be far more important than its actual taste or nutritional value. It was a performance of power, a feast for the eyes as much as, if not more than, the stomach. Even the consumption of relatively common poultry like laying hens could be a sign of wealth. Sacrificing a hen that could produce a steady supply of valuable eggs was seen as an extravagance. It was like eating your golden goose, one omelet at a time. And of course, even when it came to more mundane meats like beef or pork, which were less prestigious than game, but still a significant step up from the peasant diet, the hierarchy was strictly observed. The best, most tender cuts always went to the highest-ranking person at the table, with lesser cuts distributed down the social ladder. You might have heard the phrase, eating humble pie. Well, that comes directly from this era, referring to pies made from the umbles, the offal or innards of a deer, which were typically given to the lower-ranking members of the household or guests at the lower end of the table. Beyond the usual suspects, the elite sometimes dabbled in even more unusual fare. Late medieval recipe collections occasionally mention hedgehog and porcupine, showing a desire for novelty and the exotic, however prickly. Rabbits, while familiar to us, were actually introduced to England in the 13th century and were considered a rare and highly prized commodity. Their colonies, known as warrens, were carefully protected, and poaching them was a serious offense, sometimes leading to organized gangs getting involved, often led by disgruntled gentry. The extreme measures taken to present food theatrically, like redressing peacocks, and the harsh enforcement of game laws, like those for deer and rabbits, reflect a certain anxiety among the nobility about maintaining their elevated status in a world where wealth could sometimes be volatile. These elaborate displays and strict restrictions were a constant, visible reassertion of their dominance and their perceived natural superiority over the common folk. Alright, so we've covered the spices that cost a king's ransom, and the meats that were more about status than steak. But what about the sweet stuff? What did the medieval elite indulge in when they had a craving for something sugary? Well, this is where things get really interesting, because the world of medieval sweets was a tale of two very different sweeteners: the ancient, reliable honey, and the dazzling exotic newcomer, sugar. If you thought spices were fancy, let's talk about sugar. Today, it's in almost everything we eat, often to our collective detriment. But in the Middle Ages, refined cane sugar was the new kid on the luxury block, and it arrived with a price tag that would make your teeth ache for entirely different reasons. Sugar cane itself originated in places like India and Southeast Asia, and its cultivation and the knowledge of how to refine it slowly spread westwards, through the Middle East, into Persia, and eventually to the Mediterranean world. By the 10th century, Egypt was a major producer and exporter of sugar, and by the 12th century, it was being grown in various Muslim lands bordering the Mediterranean, including Cyprus, which became a particularly important center for sugar production, especially under Venetian and Genoese influence. They even invented water-driven sugar crushing mills there, which helped make sugar a bit more readily available, though still far from cheap. It wasn't grown down the road in England or France. It undertook an epic journey, often involving the same perilous trade routes as spices, to reach your medieval millionaire's table. Now, honey was your everyday sweetener, the old faithful. It was generally available to both lord and peasant alike, though of course, the quality, flavor, and purity of honey could vary dramatically depending on the region, the flowers the bees visited, and one's social status. Some honeys, perhaps from specific monastic estates or regions known for particular flora, were undoubtedly more prized and therefore more expensive than others. But sugar? Sugar was in a completely different league. In 15th century England, for example, a ton of imported sugar cost a staggering 40. The same weight of honey? Just 2 and 10 shillings. That's a monumental difference. To put it another way, a single bag of sugar in a consumer's hands could be worth a skilled craftsman's entire daily wage. Your sugar bowl, if you were lucky enough to have one filled with actual sugar, was basically a treasure chest. Because of its rarity and cost, sugar was often classified right alongside those exotic spices we talked about earlier. It wasn't just seen as a bulk sweetener, it was a precious, almost medicinal ingredient, valued for its intense sweetness and its supposed ability to balance the body's humors, much like spices. Sugar was considered warm in the first degree and moist in the second, making it, according to medieval medical theory, one of the best foodstuffs for the human condition, good for the blood, chest, kidneys, and bladder. It came in various forms, from coarse, brownish raw sugar to more refined white sugar sold in characteristic conical loaves, and even as rock candy or sugar scented with rose water or violets. One of the most spectacular uses of sugar by the medieval elite was in the creation of subtleties, also known as entremets. If you thought redressing a peacock in its own feathers was theatrical, wait until you hear about these. The medieval elite didn't just eat dessert, they experienced it. Subtleties were elaborate, often enormous, edible sculptures, served between the main courses of a grand banquet or as a stunning finale. They were crafted from sugar paste, an early form of marzipan, often made with almonds and sugar, molded jelly, or other fine, malleable ingredients. These weren't just pretty cakes. They were intricate works of art. The themes for these subtleties could be anything the host's imagination and budget could conjure. They might depict miniature castles, complete with tiny banners and battlements, all made of sugar. Or perhaps a scene from mythology, with gods and goddesses sculpted from almond paste. Mythical beasts like griffins or dragons, breathing spun sugar fire, were popular. Sometimes they represented religious scenes or the coats of arms of the noble families present, like the jelly described at the Count of Anjou's feast in 1455, which was part white and part red to represent the crests of the honored guests. They could even be humorous or satirical. The primary purpose of these subtleties was to amaze and delight the guests, to provide a visual spectacle that showcased the host's immense wealth, the skill of their cooks, and their sophisticated taste. They were the original food porn, designed to be gaped at, discussed, and admired, often more than they were actually eaten. The sheer labor involved, and the cost of the sugar itself, meant that using it for these largely non-functional, purely artistic displays was the ultimate flex of wealth and power. While sugar was the flashy, expensive newcomer, honey remained the steadfast, traditional sweetener for most people, and for many applications even in noble households. It was the reliable, slightly less glamorous older sibling of sugar. It was used in brewing mead, that famous honey wine, for preserving fruits, and for general sweetening in everyday cooking, where the ostentation of sugar wasn't required. The international trade in honey was also significant, with different regions producing honeys of varying qualities and flavors, some of which were highly sought after. And let's not forget fruits. While fresh fruits were largely seasonal for everyone, the wealthy had better access to a wider variety, including expensive imported fruits, especially in winter. Figs, dates, pomegranates, and citrus fruits like oranges and lemons were often imported from warmer Mediterranean lands and were considered great luxuries in Northern Europe. Getting an orange in England in the middle of January was a minor miracle, and it would be priced accordingly. Plums were a popular dessert fruit, often stewed delicately in rose water to enhance their flavor. Dried fruits like raisins, figs, and dates were also common and highly valued, as they could be stored and enjoyed year-round, adding sweetness and texture to both sweet and savory dishes. The gradual shift from honey as the sole primary sweetener to the increasing desire for cane sugar, despite its enormous cost, is quite telling. It reflects broader economic changes, the evolution of international trade networks, and a growing European appetite for exotic goods from the East. This craving for sugar, this white gold, foreshadowed the massive global impact that sugar cultivation and trade would have in the centuries to come, transforming economies, landscapes, and even societies. We've talked about spices that could buy you a farm, meats that were guarded more fiercely than crown jewels, and sweets that were basically edible sculptures. But what about the most basic food of all? What about bread? Surely, bread was just bread, right? Oh, my friend, if only it were that simple. In the Middle Ages, the bread on your table was perhaps the most immediate and visible indicator of your social standing. It was like a medieval credit score, but made of flour, and everyone could see it. We often say, bread is the staff of life, and in medieval times, this was profoundly true for all classes. But the crucial difference lay in the type of bread. Not all loaves were created equal. In fact, there was a veritable Grand Canyon of difference between the bread gracing a nobleman's table and the hunk of dark, dense stuff a peasant might gnaw on. For the lords and ladies, only the absolute finest, whitest bread would do. This was often known as pandemain, which literally translates to the Lord's bread, or sometimes manchet bread. This wasn't your average sliced white from the supermarket. Pandemain was crafted from the very best quality wheat flour, which had been meticulously sifted, sometimes 2 or even 3 times, to remove every last speck of bran and germ. The goal was to produce a loaf so dazzlingly white it was practically anemic. It was the medieval equivalent of an Instagram filter, making everything look purer and more refined. This intensive sifting process, of course, meant a lot of the grain was discarded as waste, at least from the perspective of making white flour, and the labor involved was significant, which is why pandamain was incredibly expensive. It wasn't generally sold in markets. Rather, it was baked in the large, dedicated ovens of noble households, castles, and wealthy monasteries. Just a step below pandamain, you might find wastel bread. This was another high-quality, well-sieved white bread, possibly with a slightly finer, perhaps even biscuit-like texture, though still very much a bread. Then came cocket bread, which was the more common type of white bread available for sale, and even this often came in two grades: a better quality one made from fairly good sieved flour, and a slightly lesser grade that hadn't been sifted quite as thoroughly, meaning it still contained some bran and was therefore a bit heavier and darker. The whiteness was absolutely key. It screamed, "I am so wealthy and important that I can afford to throw away the most nutritious part of the grain simply for appearance and texture." This preference for white bread, despite it being less nutritious than whole grain varieties, demonstrates just how deeply cultural symbolism and status anxiety could permeate even the most basic dietary choices. Now, as we travel down the social ladder, the bread gets progressively darker, heavier, and a lot more interesting in its composition. Peasants and the common folk were eating a very different kind of loaf. Maslin bread was a common sight on their tables, made from a mixture of wheat and rye flour. It was the original multigrain, born out of necessity and economy. Rye was a particularly hardy crop, grown extensively by peasants, especially in poorer soils or harsher climates where wheat might struggle. Pure rye bread produced a very dark, dense, and often sour loaf, a world away from the fluffy, white ideal of the nobility. This was your sturdy, no-nonsense bread. It wouldn't win any beauty contests, but it would fill you up, eventually. In northern, wetter regions of Europe, oat cakes, also known as havercakes or clapbread, and bread made from barley were more prevalent as these grains grew better there. These were often flatter and cooked on griddles or bakestones over an open fire rather than in an oven. Then you had treat bread, also called torte, or simply common wheat bread. This was generally the lowest grade of wheaten bread, very coarse and heavy, made from flour that included all the bits that were meticulously sifted out for the finer loaves. This was the bread that had seen things, the bread that had character, and probably a fair bit of grit. And at the very bottom of the bread basket, a place of true culinary desperation, there was horse bread. The name is, unfortunately, quite literal. This was the poorest of all breads, made from milled peas and beans, mixed with bran and whatever other scraps of flour or grain sweepings could be found. As the name suggests, it was indeed often fed to horses. However, in times of famine or extreme poverty, the most destitute humans would also consume it. Ironically, due to the protein from the peas and beans, horse bread was probably more nutritious than the ultra-refined white pandamain of the nobility, but you certainly wouldn't boast about eating it. Its association with animal feed made it a mark of profound hardship. The color of your bread, then, was a public announcement of your bank account and your social rank. The more intensive the milling and sifting process, the whiter the flour, the lighter the bread, and the higher its status. And, of course, its cost, due to the extra labor and the waste of the bran and germ. The very existence of such a wide spectrum of bread types, from the ethereal pandamain to the humble horse bread, and even the legal codification of bread quality and pricing through laws like the Assize of Bread and Ale in England, shows that bread was far more than just food. It was a central pillar in the economic and social structuring of medieval society. Its production, its price, and its quality were matters of serious public concern and regulation. And what did the really fancy folk eat their mountains of expensive meat off of? Well, sometimes. It was more bread. But not the good stuff. They used something called trenchers. These were essentially plates made from thick slices of stale, coarse bread, often 4-day-old treat or tourte, sometimes hollowed out slightly to hold the juices and sauces from the meal. After the nobles had finished their repast, these sauce-soaked trenchers weren't usually eaten by them. Instead, they were collected by a household servant called the almoner and distributed as alms to the poor who might be waiting at the castle or manor gates. One man's soggy, gravy-laden bread plate was quite literally another man's dinner. Talk about trickle-down economics, medieval style. In less wealthy or less charitable households, these trenchers might simply be fed to the dogs or pigs. This practice served multiple purposes. It was a practical way to deal with food service in an era before plentiful pottery or pewter plates for everyone. It was a display of charity, however meager it might seem to us. And it was yet another constant physical reinforcement of the social order, as the poor literally consumed the remnants of noble excess. So you've got your incredibly expensive spices, your illegally hunted venison, your fire-breathing peacock, your sugar-spun castle, and your bread as white as a freshly laundered cloud. How do you bring it all together? In a medieval banquet, of course. And let me tell you, if you thought your cousin Gertrude's wedding buffet was over the top, you haven't seen anything yet. These weren't just dinners. They were epic, multi-day productions designed to stun, awe, and occasionally cause indigestion on a truly grand scale. A medieval banquet wasn't just about filling bellies. It was a carefully orchestrated display of power, wealth, generosity, and often a bit of political maneuvering. A king or a great lord didn't just throw a feast. He threw down a gauntlet of gastronomic grandeur, a challenge to anyone who dared to question his magnificence. The guest list itself was a statement, and the sheer amount of food was meant to overwhelm. We have records of some feasts, like one for England's King Richard II in 1387, that included mind-boggling quantities of provisions. Over 200 cows, 1,000 sheep, hundreds of pigs, thousands of birds including swans and pigeons, deer, geese, and even, get this, 4 porpoises and 12 seals. The shopping list for one of these events looked less like a grocery run and more like Noah's Ark, but with a much greater emphasis on things that could be roasted. Forget your polite 3-course meal structure of appetizer, main, and dessert. A grand medieval banquet was a food marathon, often involving multiple main courses, sometimes 3, 5, or even more, each course itself comprising a huge variety of dishes. These dishes were often served somewhat simultaneously or in very quick succession, more like an incredibly lavish buffet than a sequenced meal. It was less a structured dining experience and more of a try a bit of everything before it gets cold, or before the dogs under the table snatch it kind of situation. The 1455 feast of the Count of Anjou, for instance, featured course after course, laden with everything from civet of hare and salted stag to stuffed chickens, veal, enormous pies containing a veritable menagerie of animals, roe deer, pig, sturgeon, kid goat, herons, wild boar, and that was just for starters, figuratively speaking. It was a culinary siege, designed to impress with sheer abundance and variety. Now, amidst this glorious, fragrant chaos, there were rules. You couldn't just dive in like a starving Viking, though I suspect some probably did, especially further down the table. Table manners were a thing, and they were another way to distinguish the refined nobility from the, well, less refined. Before the meal, and sometimes between courses, servants would circulate with basins of water, often perfumed with rose water or other herbs, for guests to wash their hands. Because even if your food was literally breathing fire, Your hands had to be relatively clean, ish. Most eating was done with the fingers and your own personal knife, which you were expected to bring with you. Spoons were also used, especially for soups or pottages, but forks? Forks were a much later invention in most of Europe, and when they first appeared, they were often viewed with suspicion, sometimes seen as foppish, overly delicate, or even an affront to God, who gave you perfectly good hands to eat with. Forks? Too fussy. Real nobles use their God-given utensils, plus a very sharp knife for stabbing things elegantly. A crucial rule was to use your right hand only for eating. The left hand was generally considered unclean, reserved for less savory tasks, so it was kept firmly out of the communal dish and ideally out of sight. No elbows on the table was another common expectation. Some things truly never change. Sharing dishes from a common bowl or platter was the norm, so politeness, not taking more than your share, eating quietly, and not being wasteful were all signs of good breeding and refinement. And where you sat. Oh, that was hugely important. The seating arrangement at a banquet was a meticulously planned map of the social hierarchy. The host, along with the most important and highest-ranking guests, would be seated at the high table, often on a raised dais, overlooking everyone else. The further you were from the high table, the less important you were considered. Where you sat told everyone in the room exactly how much you mattered. Or, perhaps more pointedly, how much you didn't. But a medieval banquet was so much more than just the food and the seating chart. It was a full-blown entertainment extravaganza. Minstrels would play music, jesters would tell jokes and perform tricks, acrobats might tumble, and poets might recite epic tales. And, as we've discussed, the food itself was often a key part of the entertainment. This is where those astonishing redressed peacocks and swans made their grand entrance, perhaps carried in by a procession of servants, looking more alive than you felt after 3 hours of continuous feasting. The famous boar's head was another traditional centerpiece, often brought into the hall with great ceremony, sometimes accompanied by its own special song, the Boar's Head Carol. Dishes were designed for visual splendor, like gilt sugar plums, or those enormous pies from the Count of Anjou's feast, which were described as having silvered crusts, gilt tops, and even smaller pies on top to represent a crown. And of course there were the subtleties, those incredible edible sculptures made of sugar or jelly, depicting allegorical scenes, coats of arms, or fantastical creatures, designed purely to amaze and delight. These banquets were not primarily about simple nourishment. They were complex, socio-political rituals. They were about projecting power, affirming social hierarchies, forging alliances, and displaying almost unimaginable wealth and generosity. The sheer scale, the emphasis on rare and exotic ingredients, the theatrical presentations, and the strict adherence to seating arrangements and etiquette all point to a purpose far beyond just having a meal. The host was keen to impress, to create a showpiece. The concept of waste, from our modern perspective, was actually integral to this display. The ability to provide such an overabundance of food, some of which might not even be eaten or was purely for show, was a direct and unambiguous indicator of the host's immense resources and his lofty position in the medieval world. And even amidst this overwhelming sensory experience, the strict adherence to table manners served to differentiate the nobility from the perceived barbarity of the lower classes, reinforcing their elite identity through cultivated behavior as much as through the expensive things they consumed. It wasn't just what you ate, but how you ate it, that defined your place in the medieval pecking order. Now, for a good chunk of the year, about a third of it, in fact, meat, as in the flesh of land animals, was strictly off the menu for most devout Christians in medieval Europe. This included not just Lent, the 40 days leading up to Easter, but also most Fridays, various vigils, and other designated fast days. And the restrictions didn't just stop at meat. During the strictest periods, like Lent, all animal products, including eggs and dairy like milk, butter, and cheese, were also forbidden. This was a serious commitment, a spiritual discipline intended to mortify the flesh, purify the soul, and commemorate Christ's sacrifices. But for the wealthy and well-connected, it also presented a fascinating culinary challenge: how to continue feasting, or at least eating very well, without actually feasting on forbidden flesh. Enter the great medieval fish loophole. It turns out that medieval theologians and the hungry nobles who patronized them got incredibly creative, shall we say, with the definition of fish. If it swam, or even if it just lived near water, or looked a bit fishy in one particular anatomical area, it could often, with a bit of theological gymnastics, be classified as fish, and therefore permissible on fast days. Perhaps the most surprising candidates for the Lenten table were marine mammals. Yes, you heard that right. Porpoise and whale were frequently classified as fish, and ended up being served, likely roasted or salted, to the elite during fasting periods. King Richard II's 1387 feast, for example, included 4 porpoises and 12 seals on its shopping list. Henry VIII was known to be served conger eel and porpoise. Nothing says pious sacrifice like a hefty slice of roasted porpoise, I suppose. The logic, as far as it can be discerned, was simply that they lived in the sea. Then there was the beaver. This is perhaps the most famous and well-documented of the Lenten loopholes. Beavers, with their flat, scaly tails and their decidedly aquatic lifestyle, were deemed fish-like enough to be consumed during fasts. There are records of the College of Physicians in Paris and even the Faculty of Divinity formally, judicially, declaring beaver tail to be fish. The rest of the beaver, being furry and rather mammalian, was a bit more debatable, but the tail was definitely fair game. The reasoning was, shall we say, flexible. It has a flat, scaly tail, and it swims a lot. Close enough to a carp for Lenten purposes. Past the beaver tail, and it didn't stop there. Certain birds also got a pass. Barnacle geese were a classic example. Because their nesting habits were not well understood in medieval Europe, a myth arose that they didn't hatch from eggs like other birds, but instead grew on trees overhanging the water, or spontaneously generated from barnacles found on driftwood. Therefore, not being flesh in the conventional bird sense, they were considered acceptable Lenten fare. Puffins, too, with their semi-aquatic habits, sometimes fell into this category. Eventually, the Church had to step in. Pope Innocent III, at the Fourth Council of the Lateran in 1215, explicitly prohibited the eating of barnacle geese during Lent, arguing that they lived and fed like ducks, and were therefore, birds. One can almost hear him sighing, "Guys, it quacks, it has feathers, it's clearly a bird relative. Stop trying to eat geese during Lent." The classification of these animals as fish wasn't based on any rigorous biological understanding, of course, but on superficial characteristics, convenient myths, or simply the desire of the powerful to continue enjoying rich, fatty meats, even during times of supposed abstinence. Even when it came to actual undeniably scaly fish, the nobility didn't skimp. Certain fish were far more prized and far more expensive than the common salted cod or herring that might sustain the general populace. Sturgeon, for instance, was often called the king's fish and was considered a supreme delicacy, sometimes legally reserved for the royal table or the highest nobility. If you were served sturgeon, you knew you were in the presence of serious money or very serious connections. salmon, eel, especially large conger eels, pike, and the rather terrifying-looking jawless fish known as lamprey were also luxury items. Lampreys were a particular favorite of English royalty. King Henry I of England allegedly died from overindulging in a, quote, surfeit of lampreys. A truly royal, if somewhat slimy, way to go. These prized fish could be incredibly expensive, with some records suggesting that fish, in general, could be up to 16 times as costly as bread. Since fresh fish wasn't always available, especially for those living inland or during the long winter months, preservation was absolutely key. Salting, smoking, drying, and pickling were all common methods used to ensure a supply of fish year-round, especially for the Lenten season. This meant that your Lenten sacrifice could still be quite flavorful, and, if you were wealthy, still quite expensive, consisting of preserved sturgeon or smoked salmon, rather than just plain old salted herring. Now, one of the biggest challenges during Lent was the prohibition on dairy products. No milk, no butter, no cheese. This was a tough rule, especially for a cuisine that relied heavily on creamy sauces and rich custards. So, what did the wealthy medieval cook do? They turned to a rather ingenious and naturally expensive substitute: almond milk. Almonds themselves were a luxury import in many parts of Europe. Grinding them and soaking them in water produced a milky liquid that could be used in an astonishing variety of dishes, both sweet and savory. Almond milk became a hugely popular and indispensable ingredient in elite medieval kitchens, especially during Lent and other fast days. It was the original artisanal nut milk, centuries before it became a trendy coffee shop staple. It was used to make creamy pottages, rich sauces for fish, delicate jellies, and even mock dairy dishes. Its subtly sweet, nutty flavor and its ability to create a smooth, creamy texture made it incredibly versatile and highly sought after. The Lenten dietary rules, therefore, paradoxically spurred a great deal of culinary innovation and further reinforced social status among the elite. They sought out and consumed expensive, sometimes bizarrely classified, fish, and cleverly substituted ingredients like almond milk to maintain a luxurious and varied diet, even while adhering to the letter, if not always the spirit, of religious observance. These practices inadvertently created distinct culinary traditions and fueled specific trade demands for exotic fish, for almonds, for the very preservation techniques that kept these Lenten luxuries available, that had long-lasting economic impacts. All right, so we've navigated the treacherous waters of Lenten loopholes and the surprisingly fishy nature of beavers. But what were the medieval elite washing down all this roasted swan, fire-breathing peacock, and strategically defined fish with? They certainly weren't cracking open a can of lager or pouring themselves a glass of tap water, the latter being a risky proposition in most medieval towns. No, when it came to drink, as with everything else, there was a distinct hierarchy, a veritable social chasm in a chalice. For the nobility and the wealthy, the drink of choice, the true nectar of the gods, was wine. Especially in northern European regions like England or Scandinavia, where the climate wasn't conducive to growing grapes, wine was largely an imported luxury, and therefore a clear symbol of sophistication, wealth, and continental connections. It was seen as more refined, and, according to the ever-present humoral theory, often considered to have better properties for the upper classes than the commoner's ale. A particularly popular and undoubtedly luxurious drink among the elite was hippocras. This wasn't just any old table wine. Hippocras was typically a red wine, though white versions existed, that was heavily spiced with a potent cocktail of expensive imported spices like ginger, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, and grains of paradise, and then sweetened often lavishly with sugar or high-quality honey. Think of it as medieval mulled wine, but on an entirely different level of intensity and with a much, much heftier price tag. It was often served warm, especially in colder weather, and was considered both a delightful beverage and a digestive aid, perfect for settling the stomach after one of those marathon banquets. It was so rich and flavorful that it was almost like a dessert and a digestive, all in one. Sometimes, it was served with special bread rolls, enriched with melted butter. A truly decadent pairing. Drinking Hippocras wasn't just about quenching thirst. It was about consuming the exoticism and status of its ingredients. The rare spices, the precious sugar, mirroring the very same impulses that drove their food choices. It was a liquid status symbol. Now, for the vast majority of the population, the peasants tilling the fields, the artisans in their workshops, the people not generally dining on gilded peacocks or debating the fishiness of a beaver's tail, the everyday drink, the lifeblood of the community, was ale or beer. And there was a very good reason for this. In an age before modern sanitation, water sources like rivers, wells, and streams were often dangerously contaminated with all sorts of unpleasantness. Animal waste, human refuse, you name it. Drinking straight water could be a game of medieval roulette with your digestive system. Ale and beer, however, were made through a brewing process that involved boiling the water, which effectively sterilized it, making it a much safer and more reliable daily drink. Your local stream might give you a nasty bout of dysentery, a medieval peasant might have thought, but a good mug of ale will just give you, well, a bit of a pleasant buzz and some much-needed calories. Ale was ubiquitous. It was drunk by almost everyone, from dawn till dusk, including children, though they would typically consume a much weaker, lower alcohol version known as small beer. It was often home-brewed or produced locally by alewives, women who brewed and sold ale from their homes. Barley was a common ingredient, being a hearty grain that was also used for the coarser types of bread. The choice of drink, therefore, was an immediate and clear marker of social status. If you were at a feast, wine, especially the spiced and sweetened Hippocras, flowed freely at the high table where the lord and his most esteemed guests sat. Further down the hall, on the rougher benches, the drink would be ale, served in simple wooden or pottery mugs, a stark contrast to the fine goblets of silver or pewter used for wine. Offering someone ale when they expected wine, or vice versa, if you were trying to be insulting, could be a serious social faux pas, like serving boxed wine at a royal wedding today, or perhaps offering a vintage Bordeaux to a man who just wanted a pint after a hard day's work. The very distinction between wine culture, often associated with the elite, imported goods, classical Roman heritage, and the church, which used wine for the Eucharist, and ale beer culture, seen as more common, local, and vernacular, helped to reinforce social and even regional identities within medieval Europe. Access to, and a discerning taste for, wine became yet another marker of a civilized or noble status. So we've established that the medieval elite were dining on some truly extravagant, eye-wateringly expensive, and occasionally bizarre foods. Roasted swans, fire-breathing peacocks, spices worth more than horses, sugar sculptures that looked like architectural marvels, and bread whiter than a freshly fallen snowdrift. But here's a question. Could just anyone eat these things, provided they somehow managed to get their hands on them? If a particularly enterprising merchant, say, made a fortune and decided he fancied a peacock for his Sunday dinner, was that okay? Oh, absolutely not. The medieval elite were very keen on maintaining their distinctions, and one of the ways they tried to do this was through something called sumptuary laws. The word sumptuary comes from the Latin sumptus, meaning expense or extravagance. These laws were regulations designed to restrict excessive personal expenditure and, crucially, to keep the social classes visibly separate. If a wealthy commoner started dressing like a duke and eating like a king, how would anyone know who is who? It would be chaos, anarchy, or at least very confusing at parties. The main purposes of sumptuary laws were threefold. Firstly, they aimed to limit what was seen as conspicuous consumption and reckless extravagance, especially by the nouveau riche, those who had acquired wealth but not noble birth. The established aristocracy often looked down on these upstarts and didn't want them imitating their lifestyle. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, these laws were designed to keep the social classes distinct and prevent any blurring of the lines. If a peasant could wear the same fabrics or eat the same foods as a lord, the visual cues of the social hierarchy would start to break down. And thirdly, there was often a moral or religious justification. Extravagance and excessive luxury were seen by many, particularly the church, as bad for the soul, leading to pride, envy, and a general decline in moral fiber. These laws didn't just cover clothing, though that was a major focus, dictating who could wear silks, velvets, furs, or even certain colors. They also extended to food and drink, household furnishings, and even the number of guests you could have at a feast. For example, in England during the reign of King Edward III in 1336, a proclamation was issued against the, quote, outrageous and excessive multitude of meats and dishes which the great men of the kingdom had used, and still used, in their castles. And it also attempted to restrict what merchants could serve. Fast forward to 1433 in Scotland, and an Act of Parliament actually prescribed the lifestyle of all social orders, going so far as to limit the use of pies and baked meats to those who held the rank of baron or higher. So, no fancy venison pie for you, lowly shepherd, even if you did somehow manage to poach the deer without losing a hand. Perhaps one of the most detailed examples comes from England in 1517, during the reign of Henry VIII. Though technically just past the medieval period, it reflects long-standing medieval attitudes. Parliament passed a series of sumptuary laws designed to, quote, limit the excessive fares of the nobility. These laws spelled out precisely the kinds of meats and, crucially, the number of dishes per meal that each social rank could serve. Cardinals, at the top of the ecclesiastical ladder, were permitted a lavish 9 dishes. Dukes, earls, and bishops could serve 7. Lower-ranking lords were allowed 6 dishes, and the gentry, the landowning class below the nobility, had to make do with a mere 3 dishes per meal. And each dish was often defined by a set amount of a particular item. For example, 1 swan or 1 peacock constituted a dish, or perhaps 4 smaller birds like partridges, or even a dozen very small birds like larks. It was like a legally mandated portion control system, but based entirely on your title and social standing. Now, did these sumptuary laws actually work? For the most part, no, not really. They were incredibly difficult to enforce. How do you monitor every kitchen and every dinner table in the land? And even when people were caught, the punishment was usually just a fine. For the very rich, a fine was hardly a deterrent. It just became part of the cost of throwing that outrageously extravagant feast, or wearing that forbidden velvet doublet. It was the ultimate rich person problem. The fine is just an extra tax on being fabulous. So while the nobles were busy trying to legislate how many peacocks could legally grace their tables, what were the common folk, the peasants, actually eating? Let's just say their daily menu didn't involve much debate about whether beaver tail counted as fish. The cornerstone of the peasant diet, the fuel that kept medieval society running, was pottage. Pottage was a thick, hearty, and often endlessly simmering stew. Its ingredients were whatever was available, whatever could be grown in a small garden patch, or foraged from the common lands. Typically, it would be based on grains like oats or barley, bulked out with root vegetables, turnips, parsnips, onions, carrots, and perhaps some beans or peas for protein. Think of it as a medieval compost bin, but you eat it, as one rather evocative description puts it. New ingredients were often just dumped on top of whatever was left from the day before, meaning the pot might never truly be emptied, just perpetually replenished. Accompanying the pottage would be bread, but as we've discussed, this was the coarse, dark, heavy stuff. Maslin bread, made from wheat and rye, or dense rye loaves, or perhaps flat oat cakes, a world away from the fluffy white manchet of the nobility. The peasant diet was, by necessity, monotonous and heavily reliant on seasonal availability. If turnips were in season, it was turnips for breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and probably mashed into a questionable dessert if you were feeling adventurous. Meat was a rare luxury for most peasants. If they did have it, pork was the most common, as pigs were relatively easy to keep, could forage for themselves, and could be fed on household scraps. Beef was far less common, as cattle were more valuable as draft animals for plowing or for their milk. And as for that delicious venison or wild boar roaming in the Lord's forest, strictly off limits, as we know, due to the draconian forest laws and the severe penalties for poaching. Their vegetables were often divided into weeds, leafy greens like leeks, parsley or wild cabbage, and roots, the aforementioned turnips, carrots, and onions. There was even a curious belief mentioned in some sources that vegetables grown below the ground, like carrots and turnips, were more appropriate for the poorer people to eat, while those grown above ground were better suited for the wealthier classes. The contrast is stark, isn't it? The lord in his castle might be complaining that his peacock wasn't breathing quite enough decorative fire, or that the 9 courses served were a tad insufficient, while the peasant in his humble hut was likely wondering if there were enough turnips and coarse bread to see the family through the week. The sumptuary laws, while largely failing to curb noble excess, did succeed in highlighting the profound symbolic power attributed to food. In legislating what different classes could or couldn't eat, these laws underscored that food was a critical language of power, identity, and social order in the medieval world. And the peasant's plate, often meager and monotonous, was a direct reflection of the economic and legal structures that kept the luxurious foods firmly in the hands of the few. So there you have it, a whirlwind tour through the medieval delicatessen of dreams and occasional digestive nightmares. We've seen saffron that cost as much as a horse, nutmeg that could trade for 7 fat oxen, and peacocks so elaborately presented they might as well have had their own stage show, complete with pyrotechnics. We've learned about the theological acrobatics that turned beavers into Lenten fish, and the social significance of bread so white it was more symbol than sustenance. It's a world that seems almost fantastical from our modern perspective. A place where your spice rack was your bank account, your dinner was a carefully choreographed theatrical production, and the very color of your daily bread told everyone your life story. But beyond the sheer extravagance and the often bizarre culinary customs, these expensive foods, and the rules surrounding them, offer us a fascinating window into the medieval mind and medieval society. They tell us about the global trade networks, however perilous, that connected distant corners of the earth long before the age of easy travel. They reveal the immense power wielded by those who controlled these trade routes, like the Venetian and Genoese merchants, who became gatekeepers of flavor for an entire continent. They speak of a deep-seated belief in the medicinal properties of exotic ingredients, a world where your food was also your pharmacy, governed by the complex rules of humoral theory. More profoundly, the obsession with food as a marker of status, to the point of creating elaborate, often inedible, edible art, and imposing strict legal restrictions on who could eat what, suggests a society where power was often performative. In a world with limited mass communication, high rates of illiteracy, and fewer of the technological or bureaucratic markers of authority we recognize today, visible displays of wealth and power were absolutely paramount. And food, being a daily, communal, and highly visible activity, became a primary stage for this constant performance of status and social hierarchy. It's also striking how many of these luxury foods derived their immense value not necessarily from any inherent superiority in taste or nutrition, but from an artificial scarcity. This scarcity was often created by the immense logistical challenges of long-distance trade, the deliberate control exercised by monopolies, and the restrictive laws like the forest laws that kept abundant natural resources out of the hands of the common people. It's a potent reminder that what a society deems valuable is often a complex social and economic construct, not just a reflection of natural availability or intrinsic worth, a dynamic that, in many ways, still resonates today in our own world of luxury goods. When we look back at the medieval peasant, surviving on pottage and coarse bread, and then at the noble, feasting on dishes that cost more than that peasant might earn in a lifetime, the disparity is almost over. Yet through it all, there's an enduring human element. Food, then as now, was more than just fuel. It was about celebration, community, even if that community was rigidly stratified, status, comfort, and the simple, universal desire for something delicious, or at least something that wasn't another turnip. Next time you find yourself balking at paying a little extra for organic kale or a fancy craft beer, just take a moment to remember the medieval lord who might have paid the price of 7 prime oxen for a pound of nutmeg and probably still complained it wasn't quite fragrant enough for his hippocras. Or spare a thought for the peasant who considered a turnip that wasn't rotten to be a gourmet experience. It certainly puts our modern culinary anxieties into a rather different perspective. And on that rather expensive, and hopefully not too indigestible, note, our journey through the medieval marketplace of the magnificent and the occasionally mind-boggling comes to an end. I hope you've enjoyed this little taste of history, a glimpse into a time when what you ate truly defined who you were. If you did find this palatable, and you're not already subscribed to our channel, perhaps consider joining our fellowship of history explorers. It costs you absolutely nothing, unlike a medieval peacock, and it helps us continue to unearth these fascinating stories from the past. Wishing you sweet dreams, hopefully filled with slightly more affordable and readily available snacks. Until next time, sleep well.